On Southwood Avenue, athletes filled water bottles from his station every day. Derek Lewis wasn't just the gym's water attendant. He was the quiet man in the corner, the one members trusted with their thirst, the hand that offered refreshment after the hardest rounds. But behind the stainless dispensers and the navy polo, something far darker was flowing. It began without noise. A runner collapsed mid-stride on his street. A boxer never rose from his evening spar. Days apart, no thread to tie them, until the ambulances kept returning and whispers circled back to the same phrase. They had just trained at Derek's gym. What no one imagined was that behind the staff doors, hidden inside protein tubs, sat glass vials and digital logs marked with red crosses. Hydration had become a weapon. Endurance turned into execution. This is the story of a city that trusted the wrong sip, and of water meant to restore life that became the slowest poison of all. Welcome to Justice Uncovered. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because betrayal doesn't always come with a blade. Derek Miles was 36, a man no one noticed until thirst reminded them. At Iron Veil Fitness, he moved like a shadow between treadmills and weight racks, refilling the great stainless steel cylinder that sat in the corner like an altar. He wore the same polo every day, navy blue with the gym's crest embroidered over his heart. Patrons nodded at him, smiling, grateful for the cold electrolyte water he poured into paper cups with steady hands. Some called him the hydration guy, a nickname that sounded both casual and affectionate. They trusted him in ways they did not even trust the mirrors that exaggerated their flaws. Students grabbed a cup before classes, office clerks during lunch breaks, retired veterans after their therapy sessions. Derek remembered each face, each schedule, each favored flavor: citrus, berry, neutral. He smiled when they smiled, and his hands moved with ritual precision. The dispenser hummed. Ice clinked. His nod became part of the gym's rhythm. No one thought of him as dangerous. He was water, harmless, necessary, forgettable. Yet Derek's locker held a notebook. Inside were not sketches or goals, but numbers: resting heart rates, workout durations, ounces consumed. He logged them without request, a ledger of pulses and fluids. Written in small, neat handwriting, each page resembled sheet music, beats marked in lines like staves, a secret orchestra of circulation. A woman's heart ticked at 68, a man's soared at 92. When their rhythm spiked after a run, he wrote the changes with care. For him, it was not data, it was a composition, a symphony only he could conduct. He believed the gym was a stage. Every rep, every breath, every gulp from his dispenser was a note. He stood at the corner, unseen, listening, recording. The air smelled of sweat and disinfectant, of rubber mats and protein shakes, but to Derek it carried something purer, the scent of exertion, of hearts thrumming close to failure. Sometimes, as he turned the steel spigot and water rushed, he imagined he was a priest distributing sacraments. The cups trembled in hands, lips touched the rim, throat swallowed. They trusted, and in trust lay his dominion. One evening, a trainer leaned over him, joking, "You know every heartbeat in this place, huh?" Derek only smiled, tapping his notebook closed. "Someone has to keep rhythm," he said. The trainer laughed and moved on. But Derek's eyes lingered, cool, glassy. The notebook pressed against his palm like a pulse. The oddities were subtle. He timed his refills at precise minutes, never early, never late. He tilted his body just so, shielding the camera above. Patrons thought it was shyness, the way he hunched his shoulders. But later, when the footage was reviewed, patterns emerged. Again and again he leaned, blocking the view, arm angled across the spout. At 6 p.m., 8 a.m., 12 p.m., his posture became a curtain, and once in the corner of the frame a mirror caught the reflection. A glass bottle, unmarked, glinting under fluorescent light before vanishing into his bag. On the floor he remained the same Derek. Polite nods. Stay hydrated. Short reminders spoken like ritual mantras. He cleaned up spilled water, folded discarded towels, swept crumbs of chalk dust. But his eyes kept drifting to the cylinder. He checked its level obsessively, tapping the lid with 2 fingers, listening to the hollow echo. When the lid rattled, his jaw tightened in private satisfaction. His apartment was bare except for boxes of supplies. Receipts piled on the counter, unpaid bills folded beneath magnets on the fridge. At night, he sat by the window, notebook open, murmuring names under his breath as though reciting scripture. He listened to recordings of heartbeats he had captured on his phone, thumps muffled by fabric and background noise. They played on loop as he tapped his pen, adding numbers, recalculating doses. In the morning, he walked back into the gym with his unmarked bottle. No one questioned him. "Morning, Derek," the veteran said, patting his shoulder. He smiled. "Morning, water's fresh." His hand brushed the steel dispenser, the way one might touch a reliquary. The CCTV tapes became the first shadow in the investigation. A junior officer paused the footage, rewound, paused again. "Why's he always blocking it?" The supervisor shrugged. "Privacy maybe, he's just shy." But the officer leaned closer, pointing at the fleeting reflection in the mirror, a bottle, clear, no label, cradled in his hand. "That doesn't look like the gym stuff." The image was grainy, but the gleam was undeniable. At 5 p.m. that Thursday, Derek disappeared into the storage room. The corridor lights flickered overhead, a buzz of faulty wiring. He pulled the door shut behind him, the sound loud, metallic. His hand clutched the bottle tightly, glass pressing into his skin. He stood in the dimness, surrounded by stacked boxes of towels and cleaning solution, his breath shallow, controlled. For a moment he whispered, "Keep rhythm," to no one. Then he twisted the lid, liquid glugging softly into silence. Outside, footsteps echoed in the hall. Someone called, "Derek, you in there?" He froze, glancing toward the sliver of light under the door. His grip tightened, knuckles pale, the bottle's outline sharp against his palm. Then, without warning, he slammed the door shut. The sound reverberated through the hallway, startling the trainer who had passed by. In the darkness, Derek's silhouette lingered, one hand still clutching the strange bottle, breath steadying as though preparing for the next movement of his symphony. The gym was always bright, mirrors reflecting fluorescent light into infinity, but Derek's corner lived in shadow. He poured the water, smiled, nodded, accepted the jokes that stuck like burrs on skin. "Water boy," one trainer whispered, loud enough for the locker room to laugh. "Wannabe doctor," another mocked when they saw him scribbling notes. Each word he transcribed into the notebook, not as words but as codes. WB07, WD13. He wrote them in neat lines, black ink pressed so hard the paper nearly tore. For him, insults became cataloged specimens, entries in a taxonomy of disdain. When he asked the owner for a raise, standing in the office with hat in hand, the reply was sharp, simple. "You pour cups, Derek, anyone can do it. Don't ask again." The humiliation burned hotter than the buzzing fluorescent bulb above. That night in the notebook, he drew a small square, blackened it until the page felt rough, a monument of graphite where hope had once lived. But it wasn't just the gym. His apartment carried its own scars. Red notices slipped through the mail slot, stamped "Final Warning," electricity to be cut if balances were not cleared. They curled on the table, paper like dried leaves. He placed them side by side, copying the amounts into his notebook, then converting each number into another symbol, another debt demanding clearance. His mother's voice came through the phone, weak, tremulous. She needed her prescription again, but the price had risen. He bought her the cheaper pills, generic, their box printed with faded ink. He pressed them into her hands, smiling, pretending. Then he went home and wrote in the margin, "Heart underfunded." He underlined it twice, black triangles framing the word. At midnight, another fracture. A message from his ex-girlfriend, the one who had once believed in his small kindnesses. Her words cut harder than any trainer's joke. "You'll never be more than a janitor with a shaker." He copied the sentence into the corner of a page, pressing so hard the pen nearly broke through. Beside it, he drew a black triangle, filled it in. The notebook began to resemble a cemetery, each insult and bill a grave marker. Even his own body betrayed him. Some nights his heart skipped, fluttered, stumbled like a drunk on stairs. He pressed 2 fingers against his wrist, counting, recording. Then he wrote, "Test subject, self." It frightened him and comforted him at once. If his heart betrayed him, he could betray in return. The humiliations and fractures merged until they became inseparable, threads weaving into a single shroud. Work and life were no longer distinct, they calcified together. The notebook became a graveyard of entries, blackened shapes clustering across pages. To him, it was not despair but architecture, a blueprint for rebalancing. The stainless steel cylinder in the gym, once just a vessel for water, became something else. He began to view it as an altar, polished, towering, reflective. When he lifted the lid and it clanged shut, he heard not metal but a tolling bell. Each echo marked a countdown. He would stand for a moment, palm flat on its side as though in prayer. He hid his preparations inside protein tubs, white plastic containers labeled vanilla whey. The powder itself meant nothing. Beneath the top layer, he had hollow vials of liquid, bitter, colorless, dissolving without trace. When he tilted the scoop into the cylinder, it was more than mixing. It was ritual. Payment, he whispered under his breath, watching the grains vanish in water. Each serving became a transaction, each cup distributed like a coin passed across an invisible counter. The first near exposure came quietly. A woman in her 20s, flushed after cycling class, drank too fast. Minutes later, her knees buckled. She collapsed against the mat, sweat pooling beneath her cheek. Trainers rushed, fanned her, called for help. By 9 p.m., she was at the clinic. Diagnosis: stress, dehydration, nothing sinister. Derek had watched from the corner, expression placid, hands folded over his notebook. That night he drew a red star next to her name. Beside it he wrote 2 words: debt cleared, days blurred. Each new insult at the gym, each notice in the mail, each call from his mother demanding medicine became an entry in the ledger. Then he measured out his responses, 1 scoop at a time. 1 cup passed into trusting hands. The notebook thickened, filled with codes, symbols, stars, triangles, black squares. He ran his fingertips across the pages as though touching headstones. One morning, as he tightened the cylinder's lid, the entire structure vibrated. It was not machinery, not the building's hum, but something stranger. The echo resonated like a heart, deep, pounding. He placed his ear against the steel, listening. The vibration seemed to synchronize with his pulse. He smiled faintly and whispered, "Debts paid in full." The sound spread, thudding in his skull. To others it was nothing but metal settling. To him it was confirmation, the bell tolling again, the altar alive. His reflection in the curved steel warped, bent, shimmered. He stared until the outline no longer resembled his face. The door to the storage room slammed, startling a trainer nearby. The echo lingered, rattling down the corridor. Derek emerged slowly, his eyes fixed not on the people around him but on the cylinder itself, as though it were breathing. His lips moved without sound, repeating the same phrase, words only he could hear, debts balancing themselves in rhythms no one else could feel. And when he pressed the lid down again, it boomed like a coffin sealed, a sound that promised the reckoning had already begun. The first collapse seemed like coincidence. A man of 52, broad-shouldered, with the gait of someone who had carried weight in deserts far away, staggered after a cardio session. His knees gave out beside the treadmill, palms slapping against rubber, sweat darkening the gray of his shirt. The staff rushed, their shouts cutting across the music, pulling him to the floor. A trainer pressed 2 fingers to his neck, shaking his head when the pulse fluttered. By the time the ambulance doors closed, his body had already begun to cool. The monitors at the hospital flashed jagged lines, then a single straight horizon. The diagnosis came with clinical finality: myocardial infarction. A heart attack, sudden but explainable. His military past gave the story texture, the doctors said, years of strain hidden beneath a chest that seemed carved from stone. Derek stood in the corner of the gym that evening, refilling cups, his expression flat. Yet in his notebook the entry was not flat. He drew a line, red, straight across the page. A mark that mirrored the hospital monitor, a horizon without return. Beneath it he wrote, "Debt balanced." Days later, the second collapse cut deeper into the illusion of chance. A student, 21, wiry and restless, stepped into the boxing class with his gloves laced tight. He had laughed at the hydration table earlier, tipping his cup back, thanking Derek with casual familiarity. In the middle of the round, sweat pouring from his temples, his eyes widened, confusion spreading across his face. His gloves dropped. He sank to his knees, then forward onto the mat, body twitching once before going limp. The whistle blew, but no one moved. Silence fell heavier than any punch. They carried him out on a stretcher, the gloves still dangling from his wrists. The doctor's words came later, spoken with rehearsed sorrow: congenital heart defect, undiagnosed, nothing anyone could have foreseen. The gym mourned twice, but life resumed. Classes restarted. Machines whirred. The stainless steel cylinder gleamed, refilled, poured. Only the notebook told a different rhythm. Derek added another mark, another red streak across the page, parallel to the first. In the margins he wrote, "Hidden fault revealed." He underlined it until the ink bled through. 2 deaths in weeks, then 3, 4, the numbers whispered around the gym. A receptionist lowered her voice. First the vet, now the kid, same gym. Someone replied with a shrug, "Bad luck comes in pairs." But it did not stop. Each case unfolded with eerie similarity. Dizziness, collapse, frantic compressions on mats still slick with sweat. By the time the ambulances arrived, the outcome was already etched. The doctor's explanations varied: arrhythmia, stroke, exhaustion, but the rhythm remained constant. The monitors at the hospital displayed their jagged dance, then the same final flat line. And each time Derek's notebook absorbed it, red ink across the paper like tally marks on a prison wall. The air itself seemed charged. Trainers whispered, clients checked their pulses between sets. "Stress kills," one instructor muttered, but his tone lacked conviction. The vending machine hummed louder than usual. The clang of weights echoed like falling gates. Even the water cooler gurgled with a sound that unsettled, as if the cylinder exhaled something more than hydration. Derek, silent as ever, poured cup after cup, eyes flicking to the clock above the wall. Always 7 p.m. The moment the gym was fullest, bodies crowding, thirst high. He waited for the second hand to touch the 12, then twisted the lid of the cylinder with reverence as though sealing a pact. To him, the altar spoke. To others, it was nothing but routine. At the hospital, one physician lingered over the records. His desk was littered with charts, ECG strips curling at the edges. He noticed the timings first, a detail that did not belong to chance. Collapse at 7 p.m. Again at 7 p.m. The third case also logged at 7 p.m. He circled the numbers with a black pen, the ink bleeding into the paper. He leaned back, muttering to himself. Same gym, same hour. The symbolic rhythm grew harder to ignore. The hospital monitors flattened into horizons. The notebook's red strokes aligned perfectly. Victims fell as though choreographed, the choreography tied to a single hour, a single place, a single figure pouring liquid from a gleaming cylinder. The pattern pulsed beneath the surface, visible only to the one who watched time itself as part of the ritual. The gym's chatter grew anxious. Some said it was cursed. Others spoke of overtraining, dehydration, bad luck. Yet the water table remained crowded. They trusted the man behind it, the one who knew their names, who poured with steady hands. Derek offered cups with the same faint smile, nodding once as though acknowledging debts in a private ledger. His reflection in the steel bent each time, his face warped into something unrecognizable, yet familiar to him. In the silence of his apartment, the notebook spread open across the table. He touched each red line as though counting the dead. To him, they were not victims but balances settled. The humiliations he had endured, the bills that threatened him, the voices that mocked him, each now mirrored by a body lowered into the earth. The page became crowded with lines, their alignment so precise they resembled bars across a cage. He pressed his fingers to the paper, feeling the texture of ink hardened into ridges. He whispered to the empty room, "Paid, paid, paid." Yet outside his walls, suspicion tightened. The doctor circled more charts, his pen never leaving his hand. 7 p.m. became more than coincidence, it became evidence. A pattern that could not be explained by stress or genetics alone. He began to trace the names, all leading back to the same gym. His voice turned cold when he spoke it aloud, almost as if sealing an indictment. Same gym, same hour. The echo of those words lingered like a verdict. At the cylinder, Derek's hand trembled for the first time. The lid rattled, sounding almost like a heart faltering, struggling to keep rhythm. The reflection in the steel twisted once more, and for an instant, it looked like a coffin lid slamming shut. They named it the Fitness Death Wave before noon. At 10 a.m., the morning shows rolled slow-motion footage of stretchers leaving the gym and filed graphics over the anchor's shoulders, a silver dispenser gleaming like a trophy beside the headline. In grocery aisles and office kitchens, hands hovered over free jugs of water and hung back. Cups stayed stacked, lips dry, the familiar ritual of pour and sip suddenly threaded with suspicion. A reporter held a microphone to a trembling woman who had thrown her membership card into a trash can. "Is the water safe?" Her eyes wouldn't settle. Her voice came out thin. "I don't think anything is." At 6 a.m., officers had entered Iron Vale Fitness with a quiet efficiency that made the air feel colder. The security gate rolled up with a rattle, lights snapped on one by one, and the mirrors caught their movement in endless duplications. A detective ran a gloved finger along the rim of the steel cylinder as if reading Braille. Another set a laptop on a folded towel, powered it, waited for the chime. Keys clicked. The screen bloomed blue, then into folders, then into a neat grid of files that looked like a life stacked in rectangles. Hydration log, one investigator read, voice flat. "Open it." The spreadsheet unfolded into rows of names, dates, ounces consumed, resting heart rates, post-workout spikes. Time stamped to the minute. The page looked more like a lab than a gym. The columns sang the same silent music Derek had carried in his head, beats arranged like measures, a clean geometry over flesh. The detective scrolled. The cursor floated over a corner, hesitated, then hovered on a faint gray triangle. "Hidden tab," the tech whispered. His finger tapped twice. Another sheet appeared. "Control." The room tightened. The air conditioner hummed louder. The new page listed names too, but not with quantities. Instead, there were check marks under a single column, exempt. Beside each name sat a note in Derek's clipped shorthand. Owner, PT, demo face, unavoidable witness. It wasn't kindness. It was curation, like sparing pieces in a gallery so the eye could see contrast. He spared the ones who stood too close to the altar, the ones who might interfere with the ritual, the ones whose survival would validate the narrative he traced in his notebook. He tuned the dose, the detective said, nearly to himself. He kept some alive to prove the others had fallen by design. A younger officer swallowed and looked at the dispenser, at its beadwork of condensation, the way droplets formed and fell like second hands on a clock. The news cycle turned faster. At 3 p.m., a local segment aired a photograph of Derek pushing his mother's wheelchair across a hospital parking lot. The camera had caught him from the side, head bent, hand on the handle, the chair rolling toward a cardiology entrance. The caption read, "Mother of suspect hospitalized for heart condition." Online threads unfolded like vines. Some commenters wrote with pity, "He's caring for her." Others dug through court records and found the final notices: past due, balance forward, disconnection scheduled. Screenshots spread, the red stamps bleeding through phone glass. People said maybe life pushed him to a breaking point. The police did not argue or explain. They stared at the spreadsheet, at control, at the columns that turned citizens into variables. At 7 p.m., the gym's clock still ran its circle. Derek had watched it run for weeks, measuring the hand's arrival at the 12 the way a conductor prepares for the downbeat. He stood behind the counter with his palms flat, the lid of the dispenser warmed by his touch, the steel moaning faintly as air shifted through the vents. The media named his work. The investigators found his ledger. The town retreated from its fountains. He did not feel vindication or fear. He felt a tightening coherence, as if the shapes on the page were finally aligning in the world. He could almost hear the notebook when he wasn't touching it, the crisp friction of paper under pen, the scored path of a red line drawn straight. The detective returned to the laptop and searched through subfolders. A folder titled Rhythm sat within hydration log. Inside were exports by week, 7-day snapshots of ounces served, heart rate increases, collapses noted in a neutral code. He noticed the entry's timing clustered around 7 p.m. He paged through to week 1, then week 2, then week 3. Each cluster tightened like a lens narrowing to sharp focus. He drew his own circle on a legal pad, writing 7 p.m. in block letters. He capped his pen and tapped the page. Same hour, he said. Same room. Same source. Outside, the story's smell changed. Cafes emptied their glass pitchers every hour, refilling and offering with apologies, but people shook their heads. Gyms across the city posted signs, bottled only, free dispensers taped over. In one studio, a client poured out her cup into a plant and watched the soil darken, as if testing for a reaction. The plant sat unbothered, leaves glossy. Her hand still shook. Derek's apartment absorbed the broadcast light. The television showed a drone shot over a line of white tents at a park, the city's half-marathon from last year. The commentator pointed to tables dense with paper cups, rows and rows like regiments, water shimmering in shallow ripples. Hydration is safety, the voice declared, a mantra against heat and collapse. Derek watched, eyes narrow, seeing not safety but architecture, the perfect distribution of a sacrament. He muted the sound and listened to the room instead. The hum of his refrigerator, the metallic clack of a neighbor's door. His notebook lay open beneath the TV's flicker, its pages a graveyard of clean lines. He touched the last red stroke with one finger and found it dry, rigid against the pad of his skin. By 9 p.m., the anchor said the phrase that would bury the gym's brand for good. The fitness death wave. The graphic pulsed behind her, a stylized heart flattening to a bar. A panel of experts traded sterile theories, electrolyte imbalances, contaminated cleaning solutions, heat stress. Then a cardiologist leaned toward the camera and said, "There is a clock in this pattern. Patients collapsing around 7 p.m. cannot be coincidence." His words felt like a blade sliding into fabric. He did not mention Derek's name, but the clock had always been Derek's. At the station, the detective held up a printed copy of Control. Names blurred into grid lines, only the checked boxes and short notes remaining sharp. He tapped one with a pen. The owner tapped another. 2 trainers. "He isn't saving friends," he said. "He's preserving the frame." The younger officer stared at the words and thought of rats in clear mazes, their paths traced in lines, the observer's purple gloves moving pieces on a table. He closed the laptop gently as if it could bruise and slid it into an evidence bag. "What about motive?" a reporter asked at the press door. The detective stared at the microphones like brass mouths. He spoke without drama. Pressures, humiliations, debts, a long calcification. He said no more. He walked away. Cameras caught only his hands, empty now, hovering at his sides as if unsure where to rest. Derek returned to the gym at opening, and the cylinder breathed in the lights again. He wiped its skin, watched fog bloom and fade under his cloth. The lid thunked when he let it fall, a low bell. He lifted it again, listened, then set it down softly like easing a coffin to a halt. In the reflection, his face wavered into something both present and elsewhere, eyes unfixed, mouth a flat line. He looked like a man practicing silence. The tech at the station kept digging. He filtered the spreadsheet by note and found a tab that did not appear on the left. It lived off to the side where only a drag could reveal it. He pulled and the hidden field slid into view. A single row, bolded all caps. Phase 2. The note beside it read endurance test. The cursor skated to the right and hit a date column, blank, then another labeled route. Nothing filled. The tech's throat tightened. He zoomed out to fit the whole sheet on the screen and saw at the bottom a line of comments Derek had left for himself. Small gray bubbles like air trapped beneath ice. He clicked the first bubble. A fragment appeared. Aid stations at mile 3, 6, 9, 12. He clicked another. Paper cups, quick hands. He clicked the last one and the words came up clear. Phase 2 endurance test, half marathon. The room went quiet as if the building had stopped breathing. The detective looked at the printed map on the wall, a loop through the river park, the long straightaway where cheering swelled and then thinned. He imagined tables of cups under white tents, the same gesture repeated every few seconds, 1,000 sips in a single hour. He pictured the silver cylinder on a folding table, anonymous among the others, condensation dripping like minutes. He did not say run. He did not shout. He placed his hand flat on the desk in front of the screen and stared at the phrase until the letters blurred. Outside the window, the city's siren stayed distant, as if waiting to be summoned. Inside, the last drop in the evidence bag slid down the plastic seam, catching light before it fell into the crease like a bead of water at the rim of a cup. At 7 p.m., the air in the gym seemed ordinary, the metallic rattle of weights, the squeak of rubber soles, the hiss of treadmills rising and falling like a mechanical tide. But behind a mirrored wall, a black dot no larger than a fly had been glued at eye level. The camera blinked unseen, its glass lens absorbing Derek's every motion. He moved with the calm choreography of a man who had rehearsed his routine too many times to feel the friction of doubt. He lifted a small bottle with both hands, wiped its rim, placed it on the counter with the reverence of an offering. To members passing by, he was again the hydration guy, the man who poured survival into paper cups. The ritual looked like service, yet each gesture carried a shadow, the invisible blade turning in silence. Witnesses later remembered odd fragments, not in sequence but in shards. A woman tying her shoes had once seen Derek peel a label from his pocket and press it neatly onto a glass jar. The letters glowed clean, vitamin C. She had smiled, reassured, assuming generosity. In court, she said the detail had seemed so small, so kind, until it wasn't. The label curled slightly at one edge as if the truth wanted to breathe through. Investigators uncoiled his past with the same patience he had once used on his logs. Records surfaced from a medical school he had entered in his 20s, an unfinished career buried under sterile archives. In those pages was a report of rats collapsing in rows, lungs fluttering out after injections of adrenaline pushed past safe thresholds. A committee had convened, language sharp, phrases like reckless disregard and expulsion stamped in black. He left with no diploma, only the residue of formulas written on his palm, carried forward into quieter rooms. What he could not complete in an official lab, he transposed onto another stage, one where the volunteers walked in smiling and thirsty. That night the gym's fluorescent lights hummed low, the floor thrummed with bass from a boxing class, and Derek's hands glistened faintly from condensation as he filled the silver dispenser. He looked like a relief worker delivering supplies after a storm, his figure framed by stacks of cups, his voice casual, generous. Drink up, stay hydrated, but what poured from his hands was not remedy. It was a sculpted fracture, a dose disguised as kindness. The steel cylinder sweated like flesh, droplets sliding down its skin. Members saw only the water. They did not see the knife invisibly carving beneath their ribs. At 7:12 p.m., a sound fractured the rhythm. A thud, heavy and hollow, echoed across the floor. A young man, no older than 20, had dropped mid-stride during a set of burpees. His chest convulsed once, then stalled, his mouth gaping like a broken hinge. For a moment the music continued, the trainer's voice calling counts, until silence spread like oil. People circled, their sneakers squeaking as they halted. Someone screamed his name. Two men dropped beside him, pressing their palms against his sternum. The lights above flickered as if straining to witness. Derek stood near the dispenser, still holding a lid, his knuckles whitening against the edge. Paramedics arrived in 3 minutes. Their boots smacked the tiles, bags unzipped, gloves snapped. One knelt, tilting the boy's head back, breathing sharp into the void of his lungs. Another pressed compressions, his arms stiff, his jaw tight. A third reached for the nearest source of fluid. He lifted Derek's dispenser, sniffed its rim, and paused, his brow furrowed. "This isn't right," he muttered. The words fell into the stillness heavier than sirens. People heard, glanced at each other, confusion spreading. Derek shifted his weight, eyes darting once toward the mirrored wall. The black dot blinked, unblinking. The investigation's grip tightened. Officers in an unmarked van across the street watched the live feed, Derek's face cast on a small monitor, his gestures dissected frame by frame. A detective scribbled notes as if the scene were theater, each line of dialogue a clue. They had waited for a collapse under his watch, for the evidence to speak through bodies rather than spreadsheets. Now the evidence lay gasping on the mat, its pulse a stuttering drum under blue gloves. Reporters assembled outside, the words "fitness death wave" scrolling in red across their chyrons. They asked about motives, about poisons, about patterns. A leak whispered of Derek's failed years at medical school, of animals lined in rows, of injections gone too far. Comment sections surged with theories. Some said he wanted to be a doctor of control. Others said he wanted the power of deciding who endured and who dissolved. But inside the gym, the truth was more immediate. A young man's chest refusing to rise, a paramedic frowning at the smell of stainless steel. The symbolism grew unbearable. Derek had become the one thing every athlete sought, the guardian of hydration, the source of continuation. Yet in his palm that source had inverted, the cure transmuted into blade. He stood in the same shirt, the same apron, the same routine, but the aura around him had shifted. People avoided eye contact, shuffled back, whispered. He poured another cup, but no one reached for it. The paper cone sagged in his hand like something already used, already discarded. Officers slipped inside, dressed as members, earphones in, shirts damp from feigned exertion. Their eyes tracked Derek's every turn. One whispered into a collar, marking times, noting gestures. Another drifted near the counter, pretending to stretch, watching as Derek bent over the dispenser. His fingers peeled at the label on a smaller vial, smoothing its surface, ensuring the adhesive clung. Under the gym's fluorescent wash, the label gleamed innocently, vitamin C. But when the hidden lens zoomed, when digital light stripped away layers, another word pulsed through faintly beneath. Isoprotronol concentrate. The letters sat like a buried confession, each stroke heavy, clinical. The camera locked on, focus tightening until the false layer quivered over the truth like thin skin over muscle. The officers exchanged a glance, silent, their jaws set. In the background, the paramedic's voice carried again, terse, urgent. He's not stabilizing. The room seemed to tilt. Derek adjusted the vial, wiped his palms, set it down softly. For the first time, his face lifted toward the mirror as if sensing the eye that stared back. The feed held on the word, crisp and damning, while the boy on the mat shuddered once more. The officers read it in silence, their hands inching toward cuffs not yet shown. The label's corner lifted slightly, adhesive loosening in the sweat-thick air. Letters breathed through, undeniable. The black dot on the mirror did not blink. It only watched as the words surfaced, sharp and final, like a knife breaking water. The raid began at dawn, the first gray light sliding over the street as police vans rolled in silence. Tires whispered against asphalt, radios crackled low, boots synchronized in cadence. The gym sat dark, its neon sign dead, windows clouded with condensation. From the outside, it was a temple emptied of worshippers. Inside, machines waited like statues, mats lay cold, and in the corner, a silver dispenser reflected faint traces of the night before. To officers, it was no longer a dispenser but a coffin standing upright, stainless steel, hiding a chorus of unseen deaths. They moved quickly, glass shattering as a battering ram struck the door at 6 a.m. The echo spread through the block like a warning bell. Derek had been in the shower, the hiss of water masking the first crash, his head bowed, steam rising. His palms glistened with residue from a vial he had rinsed moments earlier, a scent sharp and chemical clinging to his nails. The door caved before he turned the knob. Armed men flooded the narrow hallway, rifles drawn, voices clipped, hands against the wall. Now, He froze in the mist, droplets rolling down his chest, his fingers still sticky with diluted concentrate. They cuffed him there, steam curling around his wrists, water continuing to fall as if the ritual of cleansing could never finish. In the locker room, officers pried open the first containers. Large tubs of protein powder, labels intact, seals broken with knives. But beneath the top layer of vanilla dust lay small bottles nested like eggs, each capped, each unmarked, glass fogged from cold storage. The stench of solvents rose, acrid and metallic. One officer held up a jar, turning it in the light, liquid swaying inside with a faint golden shimmer. This wasn't supplement, this was architecture. The bottles formed a system, rose-coded to experiments only he could interpret. In the office, a drawer resisted before yielding. Inside was a notebook, thick and frayed at the edges, its pages dense with handwriting and scarred with red slashes. Each death had been entered, each collapse recorded like data points on a chart. Names aligned with dates, symptoms logged with precision, and across them red diagonal marks, his private autopsy of control. Officers turned the pages slowly, as if holding a living thing that might convulse. The ink pressed deep, as though the pen had wanted to pierce paper into flesh. The book smelled faintly of sweat and iodine. Symbolism multiplied with every step. The stainless dispenser under the ceiling's flickering neon loomed like a coffin stood on end, a monument to hydration turned into burial. Members had once cupped hands beneath it, trusting it as salvation after exertion. Now gloves lifted it carefully, evidence tags dangling, the cylinder's hollow interior betraying its secret cargo. It stood rigid in the crime scene tape, shining faintly, an altar of reversed trust. In the bathroom, Derek sat on a bench, his back hunched, cuffs biting into damp skin. He said nothing, his eyes fixed on a tile crack that ran like a vein across the floor. An officer leaned close, voice low, firm. "It's over." Derek blinked once, his jaw tightening as though the words carried no weight against the plans etched deeper than speech. Steam still rose around him, droplets clinging to his hair. He looked less like a man caught than a surgeon interrupted mid-procedure. The search widened. In a storage room they discovered, beneath a layer of stacked towels sat crates marked with shipping codes, each concealing chemicals disguised in ordinary packaging. Labels read creatine, whey, amino blend. But underneath were compounds, powders sharp with industrial odor, liquids sealed in medical vials. A detective exhaled slowly, muttering that the gym was never a gym. It had been a laboratory disguised as routine. The word stuck. Laboratory, not of healing but of decay. Then the final page of the notebook surfaced. Unlike the others, it held no names, no dates. Instead, a diagram stretched across both sheets, rectangles labeled hydration tent, arrows radiating out toward streets, routes, checkpoints. At the top, Phase 3, City Marathon. Notes ran in small script, calculating dosages, adjusting intervals. One phrase circled twice, endurance test. The page trembled in the detective's grip. This wasn't an ending. It was a horizon of catastrophe, a plan to lace the water of an entire city event, where thousands would line up for relief at plastic tables, cups filled by volunteers unaware they were conduits of death. The metaphor widened until officers felt it in their chests. The gym had been his rehearsal stage, bodies his preliminary data. Now the city itself was drafted as his laboratory, streets redrawn into corridors of collapse. He had not aimed at members alone, but at marathons, civic rituals, the rhythm of collective exertion. The city's thirst had been mapped into his blueprint. Each arrow in the sketch was a vein, each tent a valve, the metropolis transformed into a circulatory system he intended to stop mid-beat. One detective whispered, almost reverently, the words spreading like frost. One more week and this city would drown in poison. The room held still. Evidence bags sealed, photographs clicked, flashlights arced across walls now stripped of disguise. Derek was led out, his wet footprints smearing across the tile, his wrists cinched behind him, notebook clutched in gloved hands. The morning sun cut sharp through the broken door, spilling over his bowed head. For the first time the city saw him not as trainer, not as hydrator, but as architect of a mass grave he had plotted in silence. Yet the dispenser still stood in the center, neon light glinting across its steel. To those who watched, it seemed less like evidence and more like a warning left behind, a vessel waiting to be filled again. The image fixed in memory as officers carried Derek past it, his gaze flickering once toward the object as if it were the only companion that had ever understood his ritual. The camera caught that look, freezing it, preserving the final communion between man and machine. The city's veins had almost been rewritten, and in the silence after his removal the echo remained. One more week, one more pour, and the ordinary act of drinking would have become the last gesture of trust the city ever gave. The gym never reopened. Its doors were sealed beneath yellow tape that sagged in the rain, fluttering when wind funneled down the alley. Windows fogged from neglect, the glass streaked with dust, the once bright logo now fading into a dull outline. Inside, the machines sat in silence, their frames coated with a thin film of powder. In the center of the main floor, the stainless steel dispenser remained, its surface dull with fingerprints turned to residue. A layer of dust collected around the spout, as though the city itself had exhaled and left a mark of abandonment. It no longer reflected faces, only shadows. People passed the building with lowered eyes. At first, curiosity had drawn them to stop, but over time the air around it grew heavier, like a cordoned graveyard. Runners who once refilled their bottles now carried their own, sealed tight, refusing even free water stations downtown. Parents warned children not to touch cups left at events, and volunteers at charity races found themselves offering hydration to empty hands. The ritual of thirst had been broken. The clear liquid that once symbolized renewal now carried a stain invisible but indelible. Water had shifted from cure to sentence. Personal trainers across the city felt suspicion seep into their work. Clients stared at bottles before sipping, glancing at their coaches with hesitation. A profession built on trust fractured under the weight of memory. Conversations grew clipped. Jokes about hydration stopped. The gesture of handing someone a drink became a pause, a hesitation, a flicker of doubt. The betrayal had altered not just one building but the entire vocabulary of fitness. At the courthouse, trials moved slowly. Evidence was displayed in measured rhythm, protein tubs cut open, vials labeled and relabeled, the notebook with its slashes of red ink. Yet the city's focus lingered elsewhere, on the objects that had once seemed harmless. Gyms ordered new dispensers, but members demanded them removed. Stainless cylinders were dragged out to dumpsters, their hollow clang echoing like church bells stripped of tone. Plastic replaced steel, but even that drew unease. In quiet corners, some whispered that it was safer never to drink what someone else had poured. A small memorial grew outside the gym's locked doors. Flowers wilted quickly in the heat, but families replaced them, tying ribbons to the railings, leaving laminated photos of the first victims. Someone placed a pair of red boxing gloves beneath a sheet of glass, the leather scuffed, laces knotted. Next to it, propped upright on a stand, a medical monitor displayed a frozen line, one last heartbeat collapsing into a straight horizon. Passers-by stopped, hands on the rail, eyes fixed on the image of motion turned finality. The gloves whispered of youth and resilience. The line whispered of time stopped. The symbolism grew unbearable. Water had always been the body's salvation, poured after sweat, raised to lips with relief. Now it had become a trigger, a reminder of mortality dissolved in clarity. Every droplet carried weight, invisible but suffocating. In parks, fountains stood unused, coins at the bottom glinting untouched. Even coffee shops reported customers asking for bottles sealed in their sight, not poured by a stranger's hand. The city moved through a desert of its own making, trust evaporated drop by drop. Neighbors spoke in fragments. Same hour, one man muttered outside a cafe, referring to the deaths that had all struck at 7 p.m. Same place, another echoed. They spoke less about Derek himself than about the idea of him, the shadow that had entered ordinary ritual and inverted it. Some called him scientist, others called him fraud, but none could erase the detail of his hands pressing labels across glass, masking what had been meant for strength. The disguise had been too seamless, too ordinary to ignore. Weeks later, a film of dust coated the gym's interior. On the main floor, a single weight bench sat beneath the neon light. It faced the dispenser, its vinyl cracked, its padding dented where countless bodies had once reclined. But no one touched it now. The bench stood as a witness seat, forever aligned with the silver cylinder that had poured collapse into the veins of its community. At night, passing headlights cut across the glass, illuminating the scene inside like a diorama frozen in time. Bench in foreground, dispenser behind. Crime tape reflected across both. To some, it looked like a courtroom with no jury, only evidence locked in silence. To others, it looked like a mausoleum, the objects themselves forming an altar. The city adapted, but never entirely. Hydration stations returned to races, but runners carried their own bottles strapped to belts. Free water coolers at offices gathered dust. People sipped slower, their eyes on the rim of every cup. Trust had dissolved with a hiss, like powder into liquid irretrievable once mixed, and so the final image remained. Inside the locked gym, dust drifting in sunlight, a chair of steel and leather waited. Directly before it stood the dispenser, tall and mute. Between them stretched only air heavy with absence. No one would ever sit again. The space had become a warning, an echo of intimacy turned execution. The empty seat faced the vessel as if locked in interrogation, a dialogue cut short, a trust forever broken. The city carried on, but each time someone bent to drink, the memory surfaced. An image of a gym floor, a bench unoccupied, a silver cylinder towering like a gravestone. The betrayal did not end with his capture. It lingered in every drop, in every gesture of thirst, in the silence of a chair that would never be filled again.